Captain David Hobgood felt the airplane come apart around him before he understood what had hit it. He was flying a left-hand orbit above the Ho Chi Minh Trail in southern Laos. His aircraft was a converted cargo plane, a Lockheed AC-130 Gunship, callsign Spectre 17. Below him, hidden under 3 layers of jungle canopy, North Vietnamese supply trucks were moving south in the dark with their headlights off. It was March 4, 1972. The 57mm shell came up out of the night from a gun position his crew never saw. 57mm was the round the gunship crews feared. It could reach the altitude they worked at. And most of the men aboard were not looking out of a window when it hit them, because most of them were not looking out of a window at all. They were looking into sensor screens, the cockpit filled with smoke and debris. Years later, Hobgood described that moment in 6 words. He said he could barely see the co-pilot. In the back of the aircraft, the electronic warfare officer, Lee DeRosa, looked out at what the gunners on the ground had done to the sky. He said he had never seen anything like it. He said it looked like the 4th of July. The infrared sensor operator, Gary Chandler, was staring into a screen that showed him the heat signature of the trucks his crew had come to kill. In a single instant, his airplane went from being the most feared machine in the sky over Laos to a wounded transport with a hole in it, holding a slow circle above the most heavily defended supply road on Earth. Every man aboard Spectre 17 lived through that night. The aircraft made it back to Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. Hobgood said afterward that he was absolutely shocked the landing gear came down and held. 50 years later, when those men found each other again, they would call it both the luckiest and the unluckiest day of their lives. But the crew of Spectre 17 were flying a machine that, by every rule of the United States Air Force, should never have existed. The idea behind it had been formally proposed in 1942. It was written down. It was submitted through channels. It was rejected. It was resubmitted and rejected again. It was rejected through the Second World War. It was rejected after Korea. It was rejected across 2 decades, not because it did not work, but because the men who ran military aviation did not want it to work. The answer to the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1942. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favour. This is a small Cold War history channel, and lately the numbers have not been good. If you find this kind of research worth your time, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video. It genuinely does move the needle, and it is what lets me keep making deep research documentaries instead of quick ones. Now, back to Laos. For most of a decade, the United States Air Force went to war against a road, and the road won. The campaign had many names. Barrel Roll in the north of Laos, Steel Tiger in the south, Tiger Hound in the corner nearest South Vietnam. Later, Commando Hunt in 7 numbered phases. Underneath all of the code names was a single objective that never changed and was never achieved. Close the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They bombed it with fighter bombers. They bombed it with B-52s in mass raids under the codename Arc Light, which could turn a square kilometre of jungle into churned earth in under a minute. They bombed the passes, the fords, the truck parks. Across the war, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, a country it was not formally at war with, and a great deal of that fell on the trail. And the trucks kept coming. There is a figure buried in the official record that will mean nothing to you at this moment. Across the whole interdiction campaign, the United States Air Force would claim that it destroyed 51,000 trucks. 51,000. Hold on to that number. We are going to come back to it near the end of this video, and when we do, it is not going to say what the men who reported it thought it said. It is going to say something considerably darker, and it is going to say it about them. Because the weapon that finally began to break the truck traffic on the trail was not a faster jet, it was not a smarter bomb, it was not a new fighter or a secret prototype or a breakthrough in ordnance chemistry. It was a transport aircraft with obsolete naval anti-aircraft guns bolted through the side of its fuselage, flying slow circles at little more than the speed of a light plane over one of the most concentrated belts of anti-aircraft artillery on Earth. To understand how that airplane was finally built and why the Air Force spent 20 years refusing to build it, we have to start with what it was built to kill. And to understand that, you have to accept something that is uncomfortable for a Western audience to hear. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. That is not a Vietnamese claim. That phrase comes from the official history of the National Security Agency of the United States, written by Robert Hanyok in a study called Spartans in Darkness. American codebreakers looking at what the North Vietnamese had built could find no smaller words for it. The North Vietnamese never called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That name is an American invention. They called it the Truong Son Strategic Supply Route, after the mountain range it ran through, the long chain of forested peaks that forms the spine of Indochina. It began as almost nothing. In 1959 it was footpaths, men and women carrying rice and ammunition and mortar rounds on their backs or lashed to reinforced bicycles pushed by hand, taking months to make a journey a truck could make in days. They lost people to malaria, to dysentery, to snakes, to falls, to hunger. Disease, not bombs, was the great killer on the trail, and it stayed that way for the entire war. And then it grew, and it kept growing, and the growth is the story. By the end of 1967, the North Vietnamese had cut nearly 3,000 kilometers of road capable of taking vehicles. Not tracks. Roads. Roughly 5.5 meters wide, surfaced with gravel and crushed stone. 275 kilometers of main route, 576 kilometers of bypass, so that when a crater blocked one road, the truck simply swung onto a parallel one. Hundreds of kilometers of entry roads and storage areas branching off the network. By 1973, parts of it were a 2-lane crushed limestone highway. Down that network came Soviet and Chinese trucks, GAZ-63s from the Gorky plant, ZIL-157s out of Moscow, and the Chinese copies of them. Later the heavier ZIL-130. And in late 1965, something arrived that made the American problem far worse. Trucks fitted with radios. Now a driver could be warned that aircraft were inbound before he ever heard them. And they moved at night. Almost entirely at night. That single fact is the entire American problem, compressed into one sentence. Put yourself in the cockpit of an American fighter bomber over southern Laos in 1967. You are traveling at hundreds of knots. Below you is triple canopy jungle, 3 separate layers of foliage stacked on top of one another. Under that canopy somewhere is a dirt road, and on that road, somewhere moving without lights, is a truck. You cannot see the road. You cannot see the truck. You have fuel for a few minutes over the target area, and you cannot loiter because loitering above anti-aircraft guns in a fast jet is how you die. So you drop your ordnance on a set of coordinates, and you leave, and you never learn what you hit. Now do that 10,000 times. The North Vietnamese built their entire logistics doctrine around that limitation, and they built it brilliantly. Trucks moved after dark. Drivers waited until the aircraft had cleared the area before starting their engines. Roads were roofed over with trellises of bound treetops, so that from above there was nothing but unbroken forest. When bombs stripped the foliage away, work crews wired fresh branches into place. Telephone wire was carried on poles built so short they threw no shadow long enough for an aerial camera to catch. Bridges were constructed just below the surface of rivers, so that a reconnaissance photograph showed nothing but water. Where the rivers ran the right way, supplies were sealed in half-filled drums and floated downstream, to be caught in nets strung across the current further south. And when an American aircraft did strike, the crews on the ground had an answer for that too. They soaked rags in gasoline and set them alight beside the road, so that the pilot pulling off target would look back over his shoulder, see flames, and report a truck destroyed. Remember that. A burning rag beside a road in Laos is going to become one of the most important objects in this entire story. By first light, the trucks were dispersed into camouflaged parks in the jungle. The road was empty, and the American reconnaissance flights photographed a highway with nothing on it, and the analysts studied the photographs, and the war went on. The United States was not failing on the trail because it lacked firepower. It was failing because firepower was the wrong instrument, and the men in the operations centers knew it, and none of them could say what the right instrument was. Except that somebody had said it. In 1942. In writing. And the answer had been filed away. Now turn the story around and look at it from the road. Because the men and women running the Ho Chi Minh Trail were not a faceless enemy. And if you want to understand why the most powerful air force in history could not beat them, you have to start by accepting that they were extraordinarily good at what they did. The organization that ran the trail was called Group 559. Its name is a date. It was formed in the 5th month of 1959, and its founding order was simple. open a route to the south. Its first commander was Vo Bam, and under him it was a covert operation of porters and bicycles, forbidden from leaving so much as a footprint that could be traced. But the man who turned it from a smuggling route into an industrial logistics machine took command in 1967, and he deserves to be far better known in the West than he is. Dong Sin Nguyen was born on March 1, 1923, in Quang Binh Province, the same province that produced General Vo Nguyen Giap. He joined the Indochinese Communist Party in 1939 at 16 years old. He was wounded in combat in late 1965 and reassigned to logistics work in Hanoi, which in most armies is where careers go to die quietly. He was offered command of the trail in December 1966, took it up in early 1967, and held it until 1976. Dong Sin Nguyen did not treat the trail as a supply line. He treated it as a front. That is the whole difference, and everything else follows from it. He mechanized transport. He fortified the way stations. He built a proper command and signal system and ran it from a layered underground tunnel complex. His guiding phrase, in translation, was to move forward while fighting. The structure he built was the bin tram system, and it is the reason interdiction failed. A bin tram was roughly a regimental-sized logistics headquarters that owned one segment of road. It fed the drivers who passed through it, housed them, treated their sick, and handed them on to the next station. Cargo did not travel the whole length of the trail on a single truck. It was hauled to the end of one segment, unloaded, and reloaded onto fresh trucks belonging to the next binge tram. If a truck broke down or was destroyed, the neighbouring stations simply replaced it out of its own pool. Think carefully about what that does to an air campaign. There is no long convoy to catch on an open road. There is no single vulnerable route from source to destination. The system is a relay, and a relay is astonishingly resistant to interdiction because damage anywhere in it is local and gets absorbed locally, and the flow continues on either side of the damage while it is being repaired. By the end of 1970, Group 559 was operating 27 of these stations and moving tens of thousands of tons of supplies a year through them. The workforce grew from around 24,000 people in the mid-60s into the tens of thousands more, until the Trail Command was elevated to the equivalent of a full military region, called the Truong Son Army. It contained truck transport regiments, pipeline regiments, anti-aircraft artillery regiments, engineer regiments, and an entire infantry division. What made all of that work was not machinery. It was people. Bomb craters were filled by hand in the dark, with baskets and shovels, so that a road cut at dusk was open again by dawn. The Americans were dropping the most sophisticated munitions in the world into holes that were being filled by hand, and underneath all of it, invisible, ran the thing that almost nobody in the West has ever heard about: the pipeline. Beginning in 1968, North Vietnamese engineers began laying a fuel pipeline down the length of the trail. Not a convoy route for fuel trucks, an actual pipeline. It was pipe laid by hand, pushed forward by small pumping stations. It crossed into Laos through the Mujia Pass. It grew year by year until the network ran for well over 1,000 kilometers with more than 100 pumping stations along it. Diesel, gasoline and kerosene were pushed through the same pipe in sequence for years. Dong Sin Nguyen said afterward that if the Truong Son Trail was a legend, then the fuel pipeline was the legend inside the legend. Sit with what that means. The United States was spending enormous sums and losing aircrew to destroy trucks. The fuel that made the trucks run was flowing underneath the entire air campaign, in a pipe buried in the dirt, where no aircraft could see it and no photograph could show it. And around all of this, the North Vietnamese built a wall of guns. At the time of the bombing halt in November 1968, there were roughly 200 anti-aircraft weapons of all calibers in Laos. Within months, there were about 500. By the winter of 1970 to 1971, there were something like 1,500. 12.7mm heavy machine guns which will kill a low-flying aircraft, 23mm automatic cannon, 37mm guns which were the backbone of the system, 57mm guns which reached far higher and could be laid by radar, 85mm, 100mm. Then the missiles came south. SA-2 batteries were pushed down toward the passes, and their purpose was not only to shoot down aircraft at high altitude. Their purpose was to force aircraft lower, down into the guns. And in 1972, the shoulder-fired SA-7 arrived, which meant a single soldier standing in the trees with a tube on his shoulder could now reach up and pull an airplane out of the sky. Dongsin Nguyen's confidence rested on one assumption, and the assumption was entirely rational. It was that the Americans had no aircraft capable of finding a blacked-out truck under jungle canopy at night, staying over it long enough to hit it, and surviving the guns while doing so. Fast aircraft could survive, but could not find. Slow aircraft could find, but could not survive. That was not a guess. It was the observed behavior of the enemy for years. That assumption was about to be broken. And the machine that would break it had been described on paper in a formal proposal by a first lieutenant nobody had been willing to listen to for a generation. On April 27, 1942, First Lieutenant Gilmore Craig MacDonald submitted a proposal. It was about German submarines. His idea was simple, and it was strange. Mount machine guns in an aircraft so that they fire sideways, out of the side of the fuselage, perpendicular to the line of flight. Then fly the aircraft in a continuous banking circle around the target. Pilots call that a pylon turn because the aircraft appears to be pivoting around an invisible pole driven into the ground. Here is why that matters. In a conventional strafing pass, the aircraft flies at the target and the guns are on the target for perhaps 2 seconds, and then the aircraft is past it and has to come round again and do the whole thing over, into defences that are now awake and ready. But in a pylon turn, the aircraft is circling a fixed point, and the guns point at that fixed point continuously. Not for 2 seconds, for as long as the pilot chooses to stay there. Nobody had to invent this from scratch. In 1927, at Brooks Field, a lieutenant named Fred Nelson mounted a machine gun on a DH-4 biplane and flew pylon turns to demonstrate the principle. It was dismissed as too radical. MacDonald's proposal went into the system, and the system rejected it. He revived it in the summer of 1945, this time for ground targets. Rejected. The Second World War ended. Korea came and went. He was still trying. In 1961, by then a lieutenant colonel, he put the concept forward again. It went nowhere. The problem was never the physics. The physics had been demonstrated with a biplane in 1927. The problem was cultural and institutional, and it was about identity. The United States Air Force was built around fast jets flown by fighter pilots. It had fought for its independence as a service on the argument that air power was a decisive, strategic instrument. A converted transport aircraft, flying slow circles over a jungle, shooting sideways with old guns, was not just unglamorous. It was an insult to the idea of what the Air Force was for. And there was a bureaucratic knife underneath the cultural objection, and this one is documented in the official history of the gunship program. When the first gunship conversions were proposed, a 4-star general, whose name the records do not give us, sent a message to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Arming C-47 transports, he complained, ran contrary to the Air Force's own continuous and vigorous opposition to the Army equipping helicopters for fire control missions. It was, he wrote, tantamount to Air Force approval for the Army to use all of its transport aircraft, including its helicopters, in the same role. Read that again. The objection was not that the gunship would fail. The objection was that the gunship might succeed, and that success would be inconvenient in an argument between two services about who was allowed to own which weapons. The Vice Chief of Staff rejected the complaint. But the fact that it was made at all tells you what the idea was up against. The concept survived because of a chain of individuals who each, separately, refused to let it die. Ralph Flexman, an assistant chief engineer at Bell Aerosystems, took the idea up and championed it. Flexman had heard something that convinced him it would work, and it had nothing to do with the military. Missionary pilots flying over the Amazon delivered supplies to remote settlements by lowering a bucket on a long rope, and then flying a pylon turn. As the aircraft circled, the rope trailed down toward the center of the circle, and the bucket hung almost motionless over a single point on the ground, and people simply walked up and took what was in it. If a bucket on the end of a rope could be held stationary over a point on the ground, so could a stream of bullets. Flexman wrote the concept up formally in December 1962. Captain John Simons, an Air Force research psychologist at Wright-Patterson, carried it forward into the laboratory, and then it found the one man who would force it all the way through. Captain Ronald Terry was born in Vinton, Virginia in 1933. He took the side-firing concept and did the thing large institutions almost never forgive, which is that he went around them. In August 1964, under a program called Tail Chaser, he fitted a C-131 transport with a General Electric minigun pod and flew it himself. The aircraft was nicknamed Terry and the Pirates. He funded part of the work out of his own pocket. And he proved in the air that a side-firing gun flown on a pylon turn could hold a dense, concentrated pattern of fire on a fixed spot on the ground for as long as the pilot wanted. The Air Force staff still did not want it, so in early November 1964, Terry and Lieutenant Edwin Sasaki briefed the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, General Curtis LeMay, directly. LeMay approved combat testing over the objections of his own staff. Terry's team landed at Bien Hoa on December 2, 1964. 3 weeks later, the concept proved itself in a single night. On the night of December 23 to 24, 1964, over the Mekong Delta, a converted C-47 with side-firing miniguns orbited above a Special Forces outpost that was in the process of being overrun. Each of its 3 miniguns could fire up to 100 rounds every second, with every 5th round a tracer. From the ground, the fire did not look like a stream of bullets. It looked like a solid rope of light being poured out of the sky, and it made a noise that men who heard it never forgot. The attack broke. The aircraft was designated the AC-47. The troops called it Puff the Magic Dragon. Officially, it became spooky, and it worked so well in defense of fixed positions that within a year, nobody was arguing about whether the gunship concept was valid. The most famous act of individual courage in gunship history happened aboard one of them. On February 24, 1969, near Long Bin, an AC-47 with the call sign Spooky 71 was struck in mid-air by an 82mm mortar round. The blast tore a hole roughly 3 feet across in the fuselage and put more than 3,000 holes in the airplane. An armed magnesium flare was knocked loose and began rolling around the cargo compartment among cans of live ammunition. Airman First Class John Levitow, hit by more than 40 fragments of shrapnel, threw himself onto the flare, dragged himself and it to the open cargo door, and pushed it out. It ignited as it fell clear. He received the Medal of Honor. He was the first enlisted airman in the United States Air Force ever to be awarded it. And I want to be precise here because this gets confused constantly. Levitow earned that medal on an AC-47, not on the gunship this story is about. The AC-130, for everything it did over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, never produced a Medal of Honor. Which brings us to the part almost every account leaves out. Because the AC-47, the aircraft that proved the whole idea, went to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And on the trail, it failed. The AC-47 was a 1930s airliner. Over a besieged outpost in the Mekong Delta, attacked by irregular infantry with small arms, it was practically untouchable. Over the trail, in a sky containing hundreds of 37 and 57mm anti-aircraft guns, it was a slow, unarmoured, propeller-driven target, and its weapons were 7.62mm machine guns. Rifle-caliber bullets. Against trucks. The Air Force's response was the AC-119, and this is where the story becomes almost absurd. The Air Force did not want to hand over C-130 transports to be turned into gun platforms, because C-130s were valuable and there were never enough of them. So the Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown, pushed the conversion of the Fairchild C-119 instead, an aircraft of Second World War vintage that its own air crews described without affection as thousands of rivets flying in loose formation. 26 were converted into the AC-119G, called Shadow. 26 more into the AC-119K, called Stinger, which at least added 20mm cannon, an infrared sensor, and 2 auxiliary jet engines slung under the wings just to help the thing hold altitude. General William Momyer, commanding 7th Air Force, objected to bringing yet another obsolescent airframe into the theatre. He was overruled. The Stingers did kill trucks, more than 1,000 of them by the spring of 1970. Ground troops who were saved by them loved them without reservation. But the aircraft was never going to be the answer to the trail, and the men flying it knew that better than anybody. So look at the shape of this failure, because it is precise and it is damning. The gunship concept was proven in December 1964, And for the next 4 years, the United States Air Force applied that proven concept using 2 of the most obsolete airframes it could lay its hands on because the modern airframe that would actually work was considered too valuable to spare. The idea had been in a filing cabinet since 1942. Now it was finally out of the cabinet, and the Air Force was bolting it to airplanes older than most of the men flying them. And then somebody put the guns on a C-130, and the war on the trail changed. In 1967, a C-130 was pulled into a conversion program and turned into the prototype AC-130. The airframe difference sounds mundane. It was decisive. The C-130 was a modern, powerful, high-wing turboprop. The high wing meant the guns could be mounted low in the fuselage with a clear field of fire. The size and lift meant it could carry not only heavier weapons, but vastly more ammunition, more sensors, more crew, and enough fuel to remain over a target area for hours rather than minutes. But the guns were never the revolution. Any aircraft can carry guns. The revolution in the AC-130 was that an aircraft could now see, at night through jungle, one specific individual vehicle and hold its fire on that vehicle while flying in a circle around it. It saw in 3 completely different ways at the same time. The first was low-light level television, which took the faint light of stars and moon and amplified it into a usable picture. The second was forward-looking infrared, which needed no light at all because it did not read light. It read heat. A truck engine that has been running is hot. A jungle at night is cool. On an infrared screen, a truck under a canopy of trees is a bright shape on a dark field, and it cannot hide because it cannot stop being warm. And the third sensor deserves to be famous, and is not. It was called Black Crow. Formerly the AN/ASD5. It was passive. It emitted nothing, and what it detected was neither light nor heat. It was tuned to the electromagnetic emissions thrown off by the unshielded ignition system of a running truck engine. The ignition coil. The spark plugs. Take a moment with that, because it may be the most elegant piece of technology in the entire air war. A North Vietnamese driver could park beneath the thickest canopy on the trail. He could kill his lights. He could sit in total darkness, in total silence, invisible to the naked eye, invisible to a camera, invisible from above through 100 feet of foliage, and his own engine was broadcasting his position into the sky. An aircraft he could not see and could not hear was reading that broadcast from as far as several miles away and feeding it into a fire control computer. He could not switch it off without switching off the engine, and if he switched off the engine, he was not moving supplies, which was the only reason he was on that road. All 3 sensors fed a fire control computer which held the firing solution while the pilot rolled into a banking left-hand orbit and pulled the aircraft around the target. And then there were the guns, and the guns tell you the whole story of how the aircraft learned to survive. The first AC-130s carried 7.62mm miniguns and 20mm cannon. That was adequate against troops in the open and inadequate against trucks. And worse, it required flying low. Flying low over the Ho Chi Minh Trail was how you died, so they went bigger. They took the 40mm Bofors, an old naval anti-aircraft gun, and put it in the side of a cargo plane. The heavier round meant the aircraft could stand off further and fly higher, above the effective ceiling of the 37mm guns that formed the backbone of the defences. And then, in February 1972, they installed something that had no business being aboard an aircraft at all. A 105mm howitzer, a field artillery piece of the kind that is normally towed behind a truck and dug into the earth. It was installed in a gunship on February 17, 1972, and it was firing in combat 72, and it was firing in combat within days. On March 4, 1972, a single 105mm shell from a gunship destroyed 3 trucks parked together. The crew numbered 12 to 14. 2 pilots and a flight engineer, a navigator, an electronic warfare officer listening to the darkness for the radar of the guns and the missiles below, a fire control officer, sensor operators watching the television and the infrared, aerial gunners handling weapons that in any other context would be mounted on a warship, and right at the rear, standing at the open ramp with the night air rushing past him, the illuminator operator whose duties included staring down into the black, watching for the muzzle flashes of the guns that were trying to kill him and calling the brake. This was not a transport with guns bolted on. It was a flying weapons system. and in 1970 it was the most sophisticated night attack aircraft on Earth. And it did not hunt alone. Along the length of the trail, the United States had seeded the ground with an electronic nervous system under the codename Igloo White. Air-dropped sensors, thousands of them. Seismic detectors driven into the earth like darts that registered the vibration of an engine or a column of men. Acoustic detectors that hung in the treetops on parachutes and simply listened. Their signals were picked up by orbiting relay aircraft and passed back to a windowless building at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand. The Infiltration Surveillance Center. The Air Force historian John Carrell called it the biggest building in Southeast Asia. Inside it, 2 IBM 360 mainframes, the most powerful computers then available, collated the sensor data for analysts who turned it into a picture of traffic moving on a road they could not see. The cost is difficult to overstate, somewhere between $1 and $1.7 billion to design and build, and roughly another $1 billion a year to operate. And the honest truth about Igloo White is that its sensors were confounded constantly. By wind, by rain, by thunder, by animals moving in the jungle. The analysts spent a great deal of effort learning to tell the signature of a truck from the signature of nothing at all. But when it worked, it did the one thing that mattered more than anything else. It told a gunship crew where to look. So by 1970, the equation on the Ho Chi Minh Trail had quietly and completely inverted, and the men driving the trucks did not yet know it. A driver could hide from light. He could hide from cameras. He could hide from the naked eye. He could not hide from heat, and he could not hide from his own spark plugs. And the aircraft hunting him could now stay overhead for hours, could see him through the canopy, and could put a heavy shell into him from an altitude where the guns protecting him could barely reach. But it still had to survive. That was the whole question. Whether a slow, unarmoured 4-engine cargo plane flying a predictable circle over a valley containing hundreds of anti-aircraft guns could stay in the air long enough to prove what it could do before it killed everyone who flew it. In the winter of 1969, they found out. The 8th and last of the original AC-130s was pulled aside and modified into a testbed, carrying essentially everything the program had. Improved infrared, the Black Crow ignition sensor, laser-illuminated low-light television, an inertial navigation system, a prototype digital fire control computer, and the 40mm Bofors guns. The modification program was called Surprise Package. The aircraft would later be named Thor. It arrived at Ubon on November the 27th, 1969, and went to work. The evaluation was called Coronet Surprise, and it ran through the heart of the dry season, which is when the roads are hard, and hard roads are when the trucks run. The results are among the most extraordinary statistics of the entire air war in Southeast Asia, and almost nobody knows them. In 38 days, flying 33 combat missions, one single aircraft blew up almost 200 enemy trucks. One airplane, 33 sorties. Across the fuller period from November 1969 into April 1970, that one aircraft destroyed or damaged over 800 trucks. The other 7 AC-130s in theatre, which did not carry the full surprise package fit, destroyed or damaged an average of 357 each in the same period. The gap between one aircraft with the complete sensor suite and its own squadron mates without it was more than double. That gap ended the argument. Everything the gunship became afterward, the 40mm as standard, the 105mm howitzer, the growth from a handful of airframes to 18 in theatre by 1972, follows directly from those 38 days. And here is the detail that cuts. The program was so secret and so improvised that when the aircraft broke, the ground crews at Ubon frequently did not know how to repair it. There were no manuals for the experimental equipment. There were no spares. The most effective single aircraft in Southeast Asia was being held together on a hard stand in Thailand by mechanics working on gear they had never been trained to touch. The American fighter crews who escorted it, F-4 Phantom pilots who by every instinct of their culture should have looked down on a converted cargo plane, gave it a name. They called it the fabulous 4-engine fighter. By 1970, the entire interdiction effort in southern Laos had reorganized itself around the gunship. Commando Hunt, running in 7 phases from November 1968 to March 1972, had begun as a bombing campaign. It became, in practice, a hunting operation with a bombing campaign attached to it. On an average night in the later phases, the force included roughly 180 attack aircraft, around 21 B-52s, and about 13 fixed-wing gunships. And of those three categories, it was the 13 gunships that were killing the trucks. Everything else increasingly existed to serve them. Phantoms flew escort to suppress the guns underneath. Igloo White told them where the traffic was. The whole apparatus of the air war in Laos had become a support structure for a handful of slow, ungainly aircraft the Air Force had spent 20 years refusing to build. And the confirmation that matters most does not come from the American side at all. The official history of the People's Army of Vietnam, written by the side that won the war, singles out this aircraft by name. It states that the AC-130s established control over, and to a certain extent at least successfully suppressed, North Vietnamese nighttime supply operations. For the 1970 to 1971 dry season, it records that Allied aircraft destroyed some 4,000 trucks, of which, and I am quoting the translation, the C-130s alone destroyed 2,432. That is Hanoi's number in Hanoi's own official history about the machine that was hunting Hanoi's trucks. Of every claim in this entire story, it is the one I trust most, precisely because it is the one the source had every possible reason not to make. The gunship even went after tanks. During the Easter Offensive of 1972, when North Vietnam invaded the South with a conventional mechanized army, the howitzer-armed gunships were turned against armor. On the night of April 23 to 24, 1972, at Tan Can in the Central Highlands, an AC-130 engaged a column of T-54 tanks and reported disabling 3 of them. It could not stop the column. Tan Can fell the next morning. For years, American aircraft had flown over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and dropped explosive into the dark. Now there was an aircraft that could find a truck, identify it, kill it, and stay overhead to watch it burn. And then the United States Air Force, having finally built the machine, did something with it that would discredit the entire achievement for the next 50 years. It started counting. The number the Air Force eventually attached to the whole campaign was 51,000 trucks destroyed. In 1 year alone, 1970, 7th Air Force claimed more than 12,000. The Central Intelligence Agency looked at that figure and raised a problem with it. The agency's estimate was that North Vietnam possessed, in its entire national inventory, somewhere on the order of 6,000 trucks. Every truck in the country. Not on the trail, in North Vietnam. Total. Which meant that the Air Force was claiming to have destroyed, in 12 months, roughly twice the number of trucks the enemy was believed to own. The agency said so plainly. Air Force claims exceeded, by 6,000 vehicles, the total number of trucks believed to exist in all of North Vietnam. That objection reached the Senate. A congressional staff report in 1971 aired the same arithmetic in public. So how did the count go so badly wrong? Go back to the gasoline-soaked rags. Almost all truck kills on the trail happened at night. And at night, battle damage assessment is close to impossible. A crew sees a fire, and the fire is recorded as a truck. A truck destroyed on Tuesday is still lying there on Wednesday, still warm, still visible on an infrared screen, and can be counted again. 2 aircraft attacking the same target in the same hour, count it separately. A burning fuel drum from 8,000 feet through a sensor at night looks a great deal like a burning truck. And the men on the ground knew that and lit them deliberately. Bernard Nolte, the official historian of the United States Air Force, who wrote the definitive study of this campaign, examined the way the Air Force computed enemy losses and delivered a judgment that may be the most withering sentence an institution has ever published about itself. The computation, he wrote, rested on so many assumptions that the end product represented an exercise in metaphysics rather than mathematics. Earl Tilford, a historian who during the war served as an intelligence briefer at 7th Air Force Headquarters, watched the numbers game from the inside. His verdict is one line, and it is brutal. For all the perceived success in those figures, he wrote, the Air Force succeeded only in fooling itself into believing that Commando Hunt was working. Now, let me be fair, because there is a serious argument on the other side, and it deserves to be heard. The air power analyst John Correll has pointed out that the intelligence agencies applied a discount factor to pilot claims, arbitrarily cutting as much as 75%. More importantly, he pointed out that North Vietnam was importing trucks continuously, somewhere between 4,500 and 8,000 a year, from the Soviet Union and China. A fixed inventory of 6,000 trucks is the wrong denominator if your enemy is being resupplied constantly from outside. And here is the part that is genuinely awkward for the critics. In February 1972, the Central Intelligence Agency produced a study titled North Vietnam's Trucks and the War. In it, the agency calculated that effective truck losses in 1971 were more than twice those of the previous year, and it attributed that increase, in its own words, in part to the highly effective truck killing AC-130. That is the Central Intelligence Agency in a classified assessment calling the gunship highly effective in the same period it was telling the Pentagon that the Air Force's numbers were nonsense. Both things were true. That is the hardest thing about this story, and the most important. The gunships killed an enormous number of trucks. Nobody on either side of the argument, and nobody in Hanoi seriously disputes it. But the Air Force cannot tell you how many. The Central Intelligence Agency cannot tell you how many. Hanoi's own records cannot tell you how many. And it did not matter how many. The number of trucks destroyed was never the question. The question was whether the supplies got through. They got through. Through every year of the most concentrated aerial interdiction campaign in the history of warfare, North Vietnamese logistics grew. The road network expanded. The pipeline pushed further south. And when the gunships took command of the night, the North Vietnamese response was to build new roads through jungle the Americans had never bombed and were not watching. Roads where trucks could run in daylight. In daylight, the gunships were not there. The answer to an aircraft that owned the night was to stop needing the night. And out of the far end of that supply system, in the spring of 1972, came the Easter Offensive. Not a guerrilla campaign. A conventional, mechanized, multi-division invasion of South Vietnam with tanks and heavy artillery and the fuel and ammunition to sustain them. All of it delivered down a road the United States had spent years and billions of dollars trying to close. Bernard Nolte's conclusion, the verdict of the United States Air Force's own historian on the campaign the United States Air Force fought, is that all of it amounted to no more than inconveniencing the enemy. That is the paradox at the center of this, and it is what makes the AC-130 worth understanding rather than simply admiring. The gunship was a genuine tactical triumph, and it was placed in the service of a campaign that could not be won by killing trucks. The men who flew it paid for that anyway. 6 AC-130 gunships were lost in Southeast Asia. The first went on May 24, 1969, when anti-aircraft fire hit an aircraft named the Arbitrator. It got back to Ubon and crash-landed. Staff Sergeant Cecil Taylor and Staff Sergeant Jack Troglin were killed. They were the first combat deaths in the squadron. On April 22, 1970, a gunship named Warlord was hit by 37mm fire over southern Laos and caught fire. Most of the crew died, and then came 1972, and the sky over the trail turned against them. The North Vietnamese had spent years studying the aircraft. They knew it flew a left-hand orbit. They knew roughly where it would be and for roughly how long, and now they had surface-to-air missiles in the south. On the night of March 28th to 29th, 1972, an AC-130 named Prometheus, call sign Spectre 13, commanded by Major Irving Ramsauer II, was operating near Chapone when a surface-to-air missile brought it down. Most accounts identify it as an SA-2. 14 men were aboard. Every one of them was killed. Their remains lay in Savannakhet province in Laos for more than a decade. Excavation of the crash site did not begin until the mid-1980s. Some of those men did not come home until long after that. 2 days later, on March 30, a gunship carrying the 105mm howitzer was hit by 57mm fire near An Loc. That crew confirmed 3 truck kills, and then every man aboard bailed out and survived. The rescue that followed pulled in helicopters, propeller-driven attack aircraft, and forward air controllers by the dozen. On June 18, 1972, a shoulder-fired SA-7 struck the No. 3 engine of a gunship southwest of Hue and tore the wing off. 3 men got out, the rest did not. And on December 21, 1972, a gunship attacking 3 trucks near Paxi in Laos at around 8,000 feet was hit by 37mm fire. 2 men bailed out. 14 were lost. The aircraft was Thor, the same airframe. The Surprise package prototype, the aircraft that blew up almost 200 trucks in 38 days and settled the argument inside the United States Air Force about whether this weapon was worth building at all. The machine that made every gunship after it possible went down with 14 men aboard, 5 weeks before the agreement that ended American involvement in the war. Ronald Terry, the man who fitted a minigun to a transport partly at his own expense, flew it himself and walked into the office of the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force to sell an idea his own service had spent 20 years rejecting. Stayed in uniform for 31 years. He flew more than 200 combat missions. He retired in 1983, commanding the Air Force Human Resources Laboratory in San Antonio. Inside the Special Operations community, he is called the father of the gunship. Outside it, he is essentially unknown. He died on April 3, 2022. Dong Sin Nguyen, who built the road and the pipeline and the wall of guns, and who is the reason the gunship had to be invented at all, became a lieutenant general, a member of the Politburo, a deputy prime minister, and the Minister of Transport. He later oversaw the construction of the modern Ho Chi Minh Highway, a paved road running down the spine of a unified Vietnam, along the route of the trail he had spent a war defending. He died on April 4, 2019, at 96. And on March 3, 2022, at the Memorial Air Park at Hurlburt Field in Florida, the crew of Spectre 17 came back together 50 years and 1 day after a 57mm shell filled their cockpit with smoke over southern Laos. David Hobgood was there, Lee DeRosa was there, Gary Chandler, by then a retired colonel, was there. Asked about that night, Chandler did not talk about trucks. He did not talk about tonnage or commando hunt or the 51,000. He said that he had lived most days of his life since then just being happy that he was alive. That is what the men who did this actually took away from it. Not a body count. Not a claim in a briefing. A man who spent his 20s looking into an infrared screen above a road in Laos, saying that everything after was the gift. The aircraft did not die with the war. The AC-130 is still flying, and it has never stopped. The A model became the E, and the E became the H. The H gave way to the U model, Spooky 2. What flies today is the AC-130J Ghost Rider, and the Air Force took delivery of the last of 31 of them at Cannon Air Force Base, New Mexico, in November 2022. They carry the same 105mm howitzer their ancestors carried over Laos, alongside a 30mm cannon. And they carry something no Spectre crew in 1970 could have imagined: precision-guided weapons, small-diameter bombs and Hellfire missiles under the wings, glide munitions and Griffin missiles fired backward out of launch tubes in the rear ramp. The same ramp where the Illuminator operator once hung out into the darkness and looked for muzzle flashes with nothing but his own eyes. In November 2023, a Ghost Rider carried out strikes in Iraq in response to attacks on Al Asad Air Base. In 2025, gunships deployed to Central America on counter-trafficking operations, flying with Hellfire missiles and precision bombs on their wings. But the aircraft has exactly the same fundamental problem it had on the first night it ever flew over the trail. It is large, it is slow, it cannot hide, it cannot outrun anything, and it cannot outmaneuver anything. Over an enemy without serious air defences, it remains close to unanswerable. Against a modern integrated air defence system, it is a target, and the Air Force knows it. So the entire modernisation effort is about distance. In late 2024, the Air Force flight tested a small cruise missile launched from the rear ramp of an AC-130J. It has a range of around 400 nautical miles. The gunship is being taught to kill from beyond the reach of the guns, which is precisely what the crews at Ubon did in 1970 when they threw away the miniguns, bolted in a 40mm Bofors, and then a howitzer so they could climb above the 37mm fire that was killing them. 50 years of technology. The same problem, unchanged. And the road is still there. Vietnam paved it. The Truong Son route is the Ho Chi Minh Highway now, running the length of a unified country, and there is a museum devoted to what it cost to build. The fuel pipeline is still in the ground where the engineers of Group 559 laid it by hand, under a sky that never stopped hunting them. So what do we do with a machine that won every night it flew and lost the war it was built for? I think the answer is that we stop asking the question the Air Force asked. The Air Force asked how many trucks. It was the wrong question, and it was the wrong question from the very first night, and the tragedy is that the men who flew the mission were never the ones asking it. Gilmore Craig MacDonald was right in 1942. Ralph Flexman was right in 1962. Ronald Terry was right when he paid out of his own pocket to prove it in the sky over Florida. And an institution built to prize speed and altitude and glamour spent 20 years refusing to hear any of them because the answer arrived in the wrong shape, attached to the wrong airplane and offered by the wrong kind of officer. By the time the Air Force listened, the road was too wide to close, the pipeline was already flowing beneath the bombing, and an army was already moving south underneath the trees. The gunship was never too little, it was only and always too late.